Good morning and welcome to the future generation mix dominated by renewables. How will we get there? This is the 12th webinar in our ongoing series, which has already attracted something like 8,700 registrations. No, not all for this splendid session. That's the total number since May. But it's great to welcome so many of you here today. I like to imagine that each of our sessions is held in the Lomond Auditorium at the SEC in Glasgow, home of our live show. I can assure you, from where I am standing behind my imaginary lectern, that huge theatre is very comfortably full. Not to the gunnels, but a healthy 420 plus audience. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director of All Energy and Decarbonise and co-creator of the event that was first staged in 2001. Nowadays, I primarily create the conference, which under normal circumstances has around 600 speakers over the 2 days. In the new normal, I'm really having fun creating webinars, or in this case, working with a sponsor to create a session that meets their aims. I was delighted when SmartestEnergy said they would like to organise a webinar with us and sponsor it too. Thank you, Angus Widdowson, and your colleague, Emma Smeaton. It's been great working with you. And if our session last week, when we all got together, is anything to go by, we're all in for a very rewarding 90 minutes. Before I pass over to Angus to chair the session, there's a tiny bit of housekeeping. There'll be a poll during this webinar. To take part in it, if you're on full screen, you'll have to minimize it to see and click on the word vote. And can we ask you too to look out for rate this? That's where you can not only rate this webinar, but also feed in your comments about other webinars you'd like us to hold in the coming months. Perhaps you'd like to sponsor one that we're already working on, or come up with your own ideas as SmartestEnergy did. Your questions to the panel obviously go where it says questions. I've just one slide. Here you'll see the URL telling you where to find today's presentations. They're bottom right on that page, and also where to find this and our other 11 webinars and use our on-demand facility. There's still time to book this afternoon's session on finance and funding. Spread word. Now, with yet another heartfelt word of thanks to all on the panel, I'd like to pass over to Angus to get this webinar on its riveting road.
Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you all for signing up to today. It has been it's been quite overwhelming, the great response that we've had in the lead up to the webinar with the numbers joining, and I really hope we can give you a worthwhile session, and there's lots of great discussion to be had from an esteemed panel. The aim of today is to have a look at the future generation mix and the contribution from renewables, and most importantly, the independent sector. For those that don't know, SmartestEnergy is a supplier and aggregator of independent generation, and we are here to champion independent generation and bring a call to action on various points that will be discussed today. So we've got some really positive discussion to have. Brief introduction to myself, and then I would like to introduce the panel before sharing some thoughts to start the session today. I'm Angus Widdowson. I'm head of smart generation at SmartestEnergy. We look after around about 3 gigawatts of generation, from renewables to flexibility, including gas peaking generation and battery storage. And we've been owned by the Marubeni Corporation since our incorporation nearly 20 years ago now. Right, now joining me today, I will just give a very brief introduction to our panel in the order that they will appear. So we have George Baxter, Director of Development at Green Power. George joined Green Power after 12 years at SSE in 2019 and leads their development program. in addition to playing a key role in delivering consents and a construction pipeline of over 3.5 gigawatts of renewable energy and storage projects, while at SSE, George has significant experience in public affairs, government relations, policy and communications. Thank you for joining us, George. Next up, we have Penny Carruthers, CEO and founder of Carruthers Renewables. Penelope is the inventor of the Carruthers wheel, the first water wheel patented in over 100 years, and the only water wheel specifically designed to generate electricity, which is particularly effective with very low head hydropower. And Penny's going to talk us through some interesting landscape that this technology can open up, and she introduces to some of the challenges that are being faced in the hydro sector. After Penny, we have Robert Hockin, managing partner of Greenback's Investment Capital. Greenback's a specialist for climate, clean tech and circular economy venture capital, advises internationally for equity, asset and project finance, and hosts of the Greenbackers Climate Pitch, an invitational introducing entrepreneurs to active funders. Thank you for joining us, Robert. And last but not least, Stuart Lunn, Commercial Director at RES. RES is the world's largest independent renewable energy company, and Stuart has been involved in the financing of renewable energy projects for 15 years across offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, storage. And Stuart leads a team at RES that's responsible for all M&A, procurement, PPA origination, and various other activities across the UK and Ireland. So thank you, Stuart, for joining us. Great. Well, what I would like to do next is launch straight into my presentation, if the technology will allow. Right. The future energy mix and how will we get there? I just wanted to start off by having a quick look back at some stats and where we've got to before we look at the forecast. So, over the last 10 years, this chart here is going to show us some really interesting figures and achievements that have been made. Most importantly, what I would like to point out, coal has reduced from having a 28% share of the UK generation mix down to a staggering 4%, as you can see in the navy portion that is reducing there. Onshore wind and solar from 2% in 2010 up to a staggering 17% as of this year. The hydro sector having just around 1% of the market in 2010 has nearly tripled, and that excludes pump storage, so we're talking about run of river and smaller storage hydro. The last point I'd like to make on this is that oil, thankfully, has nearly exited the system in terms of a generation technology type. There is a small portion of oil still online, but very rarely utilized, which is fantastic. Then, just to wrap up on the milestones that have been achieved, and more recently, in Q1 this year, we saw renewables taking a record share, 47% of overall generation in the UK, which is really quite amazing. In Q2, we followed with another record, given fairly unique circumstances in terms of demand, but nevertheless, coal was off the system for a total of 67, nearly 68 days. The first time that has happened since the Industrial Revolution. I think what this shows us is just gives us some of the evidence for continued success of the renewables industry, of which the independent sector has played a very important role, particularly in the last 10 years. Now looking ahead, we've taken a deep dive into National Grid's latest Future Energy Scenarios report, published just in July there. Now, some of the things I want to pull from this, just to set the scene for today. National Grid note that Net zero by 2050 sounds a long way out, but net zero is absolutely achievable, though this is not without its caveats, including changes to the policy landscape, as well as increased societal and consumer engagement that we're going to discuss today. Now, I think it's really interesting to see that in 3 of the 4 scenarios that National Grid foresee, the target of reaching net zero by 2050 is absolutely achievable. And the only scenario that doesn't see that is what they note as steady progression, and effectively no change and no progress. In relation to the energy sector specifically, this of course relies on the continued deployment of renewable generation, at least an additional 40 gigawatts by 2030 required according to the report, as well as the development and implementation of carbon capture and storage technologies in the next 10 years or so, in order to enable the power sector to reach net zero emissions by 2033, some 17 years ahead of the overall goal. So that is also achievable. Breaking that down just a level further, National Grid foresee that at least 1.4 gigawatts of solar and 3 gigawatts of wind would need to be built every year between now and 2050 to do that. And that's the sort of discussion we want to be having today in terms of how do we enable that. So this would allow zero marginal cost generation, renewable generation, to make up around 70% of generation by 2030. This scale of change cannot be achieved without a variety of solutions and support from government, suppliers like us, developers, funders, which are well represented on the panel today, and consumers, to ensure that the level of investment required to support a decarbonised energy system really does exist. So we're going to have one poll today, and this will hopefully be popping up on your screens now, and it would be great if you could participate. What this is what we're looking for as a response, and what the biggest challenges for independent generators in achieving the renewable growth targets set out in the Future Energy Scenarios report. So we've put up 4 options. There are many others, but that we will discuss. But the 4 options that we've put here are: A, policy support; B, investor confidence; C, revenue certainty; and D, grid infrastructure. Now, just while you're doing that, we will come to the results later on in the discussion. We've actually been at SmartestEnergy have been sharing this online over the last week on Twitter and LinkedIn and various platforms, and I've got some interesting results to share from that, which show that the votes have overwhelmingly gone in favour of revenue certainty being the key challenge, closely followed by policy support. So we'll have to pick up on those in the discussion at the end. Right, just to wrap up my introduction here then, what is the role of the supplier? So where does Smartest sit in this, and what is it we're doing to help enable this this increased penetration of independent and renewable generation? So key for us is investment in technology. 2 years ago, we appointed a chief technology officer, quite a big shift for an energy supplier, and that has resulted already in 2 key changes. One is the launch of an asset optimization platform to enable flexible generation assets to access markets in near real time. That's a big shift from the traditional selling of power forward and reporting based on and operating based on that. The second of which is the launch of our SmartFlex platform that was launched this year, and this is to allow renewable generators to access trading desks and to be able to hedge their power in blocks, so that they can take a much more flexible approach and spread their risk in how they sell their power to the market. And this is a very long way from 10-20 years ago, when when really a bilateral contract with very few off-takers in the market was available. So our strategy in technologies is advancing all the time, and those platforms are central to our strategy going forward. Then revenue streams and contract structures. So there are various markets that our customers participate in. Corporate PPAs are becoming increasingly important for the consumer side, where pressures on their ambitions and their contribution to achieving net zero are increasing, and that is building appetite to give real additionality to new build renewable generation projects. And our role is to marry the supply of those corporate PPAs with the demand in terms of new build generation. Then the contracts for difference scheme. So providing access to market, providing a route to market, and providing balancing services for those generators has been important over the last few years and will continue to be important, particularly with the reintroduction of onshore wind and solar into the contracts for difference mechanism, as we expect from next year. Then opening up new revenue streams and taking a broader and more dynamic approach to revenue streams. So the balancing mechanism, which has become essential for flexible generation, and actually 80 to 90% of transactions we see for flexible generation are through the balancing mechanism, where 12 months ago the majority of revenues were in the ancillary services market, most notably the store market, and also other wholesale markets. So that has changed rapidly, and we expect that change to continue. The ODFM market, the optional downward flexibility management service that National Grid introduced as a result of lockdown measures and the reduction in demand, it is really important that suppliers can unlock revenue streams like this and protect assets, generation assets, against being switched off the system in times of emergency stress, but also be able to monetize these opportunities. Ancillary services, my final point on this, opening up opportunities where National Grid are establishing services to incentivize other technologies, new technologies, some of which we'll hear about later today. My final point, enabling co-location. There has been huge interest in enabling battery storage with solar generation. Solar developers are increasingly looking at battery storage to protect against the revenue streams and future capture prices of solar through adding technology to the site. And Smartest role in this, and the supplier's role in this more broadly, is to ensure that we bring these technologies together and optimize the capability of those in the medium to longer term by making sure they're placed in the right markets, and also ensuring that we're giving the right information to developers to make sure that they are located in the most optimal locations. So that's it from me to kick us off. What I would now like to do is hand over to George Baxter of Green Power, who is going to take us through the next part of the session. Thank you, George.
Thanks very much. Yeah, just while I get myself sorted out on my presentation, I'd just like to tell you all about a poll that I would be grateful if you would participate in. I will try desperately not to influence your votes while I'm doing my presentation, but might be quite tricky once you see what I've got to say. Essentially, I'm asking you what you think the greatest policy hurdle or challenge is facing onshore wind, with the options of landscape policy and planning, access to a CFD, or public opinion. So hopefully that will stimulate a bit of discussion later on. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Great. So I just thinking about the actual this whole session. How will we get there is quite an important question, but I think also where are we going is also important. I think the future should be about how renewables can become the entirety of the energy system. If it isn't renewable, then by definition, it's not sustainable in the long term. And green electrons need to power transport and heat, as well as traditional power consumption. And whilst we're doing pretty well on electricity, we've hardly scratched the surface, really. Even in Scotland, where renewable electricity has blossomed over the last 10, 15 years, we still have around 80% of the economy to decarbonise. So I think that's the big aim. And it is, of course, a journey, but that journey has to be rapid, relatively short to confront the climate crisis. Too often, I think debates about renewables are theoretical about dates far off into the future or held back by short-term political election concerns. It's a crisis, we need to act. And so a focus on 2030 targets is by far the more meaningful to discuss than net zero by 2050 or 2045. There's many technologies that can be deployed. Arguably, we have all the technology we need, although there's clearly room for more in the longer term for wave and tidal, for floating wind, for offshore, etc. But the opportunity for onshore wind to continue to do the heavy lifting as the cheapest and easiest to deploy to meet 2030 targets, I think is very significant. So there's a key role for onshore wind. This kind of slide speaks for itself. We have to quadruple capacity, and onshore wind should be central to that. The Climate Change Committee recommends significant amounts, and there will be opportunities for the UK for onshore wind, but it is likely that Scotland is going to continue to dominate with the most space and the best wind resource. And to meet these targets, and they should be targets, we need to install around 1.5 gigawatts per year right now. Unfortunately, I think we are nowhere near that. This next slide shows a significant amount in the pipeline. And you can see that, and from other reports, the amount in construction has tapered off massively following an end to the ROCs regime. And even with the prospects of CFD, PPAs, or on a merchant basis, projects will only work if they're highly competitive, which means the most efficient, modern, larger turbines are installed, and installed in windy locations. This next slide, I've dug into some of the detail of these figures in the pipeline, and my view is that there's not 8 gigawatts of onshore wind shovel ready. And I've heard that here and there quite a lot of late. Our own assessment so far of what is in the pipeline points to around only 1.3 gigawatts consented at potential commercial viability level. And with Viking going into construction in Shetland, what remains is less than 1 gigawatt, with much of this likely awaiting a CFD route to market. And around 3.5 gigawatts in planning are above 145 metre tip heights. But what awaits them as they struggle through the planning policy process, that is really a significant question. And we're not seeing rapid consenting at scale. This next slide, hopefully you can see this okay. Apologies for the small print, but I've sort of crammed 2 slides together here, and acknowledging a thank you to Jennifer Ballantyne at Pinsent Masons, who presented this at a seminar last week. You can see the rate of the rate of decision making through the planning system is beginning to take on a kind of slow grind look. 50% of projects going to public inquiry are refused. and the determination time with a PLI is very long at 44 months. And these averages exclude the 120 months for SSE's Strathy South project, which also had a desk time at 24 months. And that, if that was included here, it would have made these figures look even poorer. So the policy outlook should be changing in a climate emergency. And these are comments from Scotland's First Minister. Apologies for my focus on Scotland. I'm Scottish, I work in Scotland, but equally, I think some of the challenges for planning are significant across the UK, obviously, as many will be aware. But these are comments from the First Minister of Scotland, and these are warmly welcomed and create great expectations of radical and significant rapid change. Even more so given the COVID-19 situation and the opportunity for massive investment very quickly. And the climate emergency really needs leadership like this. Give you a second to just read those quotes, they're quite powerful. So what is the policy outlook in that climate emergency and following these statements by the First Minister? Unfortunately, the subsequent steps have not been so encouraging. We've had the draft National Planning Framework 4 delayed to autumn 2021, and a gap filler is obviously needed. And recently, we've been presented with a consultation by Scottish Government on removing an existing presumption in favour of sustainable development from existing planning policy. We're seeing overtly negative local development plans and guidance still being approved, with public inquiries becoming normal. And at our heart of the problem is not the level of commitment to a climate emergency at one end of the scales, it's the anchoring down of the scales at the other end by landscape capacity studies. These things have become, have spread throughout Scotland and are out of date, they're out of touch, they're not fit for purpose, and they're inherently negative. The aim is kind of noble, it's trying to be helpful, but they aren't about the right projects in the right places, which is how they're sold. It's more about as few projects and as few places as possible. And a reality check is needed. What we need is more flexibility, a more positive approach, an end to the kind of deterministic, landscape-led spatial mapping approach, which just injects conflict into the process. And we need a more objective site-by-site approach. Now, SNH has consulted recently on landscape, but I would say it falls way short of what is needed. They're proposing replacing these capacity studies with sensitivity assessments, but it is not, I think, as built. It's not just a technical document for landscape architects, it's much more than that. It's also a minor fiddling and amounts to business as usual, supporting unnecessary and negative deterministic conflict in planning, and is not a more pragmatic approach which the climate emergency demands. So I would encourage people to respond to that consultation that's just out, and it's very negative. Essentially, these things just say that turbines that are not commercially viable are appropriate in very few places, and it doesn't really add up, in my opinion. I'm going to leave you with this final slide. It's a spot the problem competition. This is an example of a piece of a landscape capacity study where wind farms are thought to be potentially suitable by a local authority in Scotland. The same study, however, says that there are no areas of the entire region suitable for extensive wind farms with large turbines. And this report was from 2014, just incorporated into policy now from 2014, when 125 metre turbines were considered large. There are even landscape capacity studies, for example, that recommend the removal of community turbines, which is particularly galling. So I'll leave you with this. Your challenge and spotting the problem is to work out what the little purple dots are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. And we'll come back to that in discussion at the end, I think, as well as your poll results. Thank you for all who voted on that. Next up, Penny Carruthers, CEO and founder of Carruthers Renewables. Penny. You may be muted there, Penny.
I am so sorry.
Thank you.
A bit of a, oh well. Anyway, you may be wondering, what has hydropower got to do with future renewables? Surely we've been there, done that. There's not much to be done. Well, I'm here to explain why that's not true. Now, I am Penelope Carruthers, and I am the founder of Carruthers Renewables, which is purely here to unlock half the world's hydropower potential. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, isn't most of the world's hydropower potential locked for a reason? The costs, both environmental and financial, is just too high for this. And you're right. That's why I'm only looking at a half. Now, what I'm looking at is called very low head hydropower. That's drops of less than 10 meters that are uneconomic using conventional technologies. Now, this is an excellent example in Yorkshire of the type of innovation that was occurring in the UK up until very recently. Now, unfortunately, most drops in rivers are not localized. They're not weirs, they're not waterfalls. They can span up to 100 meters of river bank easily, which means that a standard run-of-river scheme is not the best idea. It's got another name. It's called an outflow system, where you take the water out of the riverbed and you put it through the turbine and then return it. There is an alternative, and that is the inflow system. That's where you direct the water in the riverbed through your turbine. This has many advantages. It reduces the capital expenditure by removing much of the civil engineering. It increases the income because you can use up to 4 times the amount of water. And because of how you do it, it reduces the environmental footprint. SEPA, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, don't even require a hydropower licence for an inflow system. They view these in the same bracket as bridge supports. They have that little impact on the environment. Now, to do this successfully, your turbine must work at atmospheric pressure, be entirely fish friendly, allow free movement of sediment, and be strong enough to withstand rocks. And that's why I invented the Carruthers wheel, which is the first modern water wheel, basically, and something so simple that the most expensive and sophisticated component is the bolts. Now, the good news is this is base load, seasonal base load. Yes, you get more electricity in the winter than you do in the summer, but it's entirely predictable. Very little stress on grid nodes. There are thousands of weirs left over from the Industrial Revolution in the UK, and we figure over 100 of these would have been profitable without feed-in tariffs, even more with them. And that's not even considering the number of natural cascades. Unfortunately, there is no count of these, but there's a lot of them. And easily, so that this could have a serious impact on the future renewable mix of this country. I am not even going to touch on tidal mills. We do have one of the world's largest tidal ranges, but the costs in investigating that and getting that done is not possible at the moment. The bad news is hydropower is the most taxed renewable energy out there. According to a recent report from the Scottish Government, business rates on hydropower is on average just under a quarter of the turnover. This is a multiple of what is charged for solar and wind installations, to the point that since the 2017 business rate revaluation, profitable English projects, and they were mainly community projects, went bankrupt. They had to sell the equipment and just give up. Reliefs were granted in Scotland and Wales, but because these are seen as one-offs, temporary, you can't raise finance in this country for a commercial hydropower project. You basically have to be a rich Scottish or Welsh landowner. This is eco-bling now. It's not for the types of you and me. And the ugly news is it's unlikely to get any better. The hydropower industry in this country has been trying to get hydropower derated so that the taxes applied can be similar to solar and wind. Now that requires UK primary legislation, i.e. Rishi Sunak needs to get involved. Now, the recommendations to the Scottish Government are that this is inappropriate. It's going a step too far for what is considered a small market. Now, that is a reasonable assumption to make if you don't expect innovation in hydropower, which is the case, because onshore hydropower is not considered an area where innovation can actually happen. And unless attitudes change that allow innovation to come from left field, to allow for the unexpected, then we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve for this climate emergency. And the energy catapult, which was set up to foster innovation, specifically only looks at marine hydropower. That's tidal currents. If you're onshore or tidal, forget it. It is not considered a viable area for research. Now, the reason I haven't just given up is this map here. This is the climate of the world. Now, the blue zones are the places with the most rain. Therefore, they have the most water, and they have the most very low head hydropower. In particular, those very dark blue bits, that's rainforest. A great place for hydropower, but you really don't want to be damaging the environment. So this means that whilst there is enough scope in the UK that, if it was allowed, could turbocharge an entirely new market worth hundreds of billions worldwide in energy, jobs, tax income, it's probably not going to happen here unless something happens. It's going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, where, as far as I'm concerned, I am very happy that Innovate UK is running competitions for innovation. And that is hopefully where I will be able to get my first one built. Fingers crossed. So basically, we have the innovation and we have the brains here in this country to do some amazing things, but we need support. The future is bright, but it needs help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Penny. A great representation of some of the innovation that's required and the support for innovation that's required to help us get to net zero. Next up, Robert Hockin from Greenbackers Investment Capital. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Some good presentations. Very impressed with the some of the the things that have been spoken about. I'm going to touch on some of these in my own presentation. Let me just share my window, get my program up, and start from the beginning. Hope you can all see that. So a little bit about Greenbacker, set the context of why I'm here and why I'm talking about this. I think I'm the token American in here, but as a Chicagoan, I've been in the UK for 30 years. Greenbackers specialized in climate, clean tech, circular economy capital, and what that means is we connect companies that mainly entrepreneurs, technology entrepreneurs, to capital. So we do manage fundraisers, private placement campaigns. Our clients are mainly in the UK, Western Europe, and we run Series A through Series C campaigns upwards of 50 million. We also have an investment pitch that we run twice a year, and that 10 to 200 plus means that we take 10 entrepreneurs that we select by competitive evaluation, and we introduce them to 200 plus investors by webcast, by doing a webinar such as this. We also do some coaching for investment readiness. We look at pitch decks, we look at the business plan, and we try to get entrepreneurs who may be inexperienced in presenting to investors. We get them as ready as they can be. I've got a great team. It's not just myself. Andrew Smith, who Judith mentioned, will be doing a later session today. Ex-Scottish Investment Bank, John Steedman, ex-BP Ventures. We've got some strong corporate experience. My backstory is technology and finance with ABB, WorldCom, and the old GEC Marconi before I pivoted into clean tech and climate about 12, 13 years ago. So in considering this topic, I had to ask the question, and I appreciate George's confidence, and what we need to do to get there. I had to beg the question: how will we get there, and what are the mechanisms by which we will get to a dominant renewable part? I almost work from the assumption that renewables, it has to be our future. So, is it through innovation? My God, we're awash with innovation. Aside from scaling existing technologies, improving existing technologies, what I almost call conventional renewables, you've got some very interesting things coming down the pipe. Hybrid wind and wave, solar power using microstructures. This is very thin film. Solar technology can go on non-load bearing roofs. A lot of innovation that we focus on is based on storage, whether it be vehicle to grid or balancing, to gravity storage. There are other types of technologies out there, cryogenic air, thermal and compressed air. The newest one on the bottom left, coated bricks that can actually generate electricity. This is an exciting technology to watch. Half of these companies these are not pie in the sky offerings. Almost all these technologies are in the market. Half of these companies are Greenbacker's clients that we're supporting, so I couldn't resist a bit of a commercial pitch here, and I was interested in the pumped hydro storage arena. It's not only through a tidal, but large, if you will, water batteries. Technology has been around for 100 years. Can be an important part of the energy mix. One of the primary obstacles stopping us from relying heavily on renewable energy systems is that we can't regulate them when they regulate when they provide us power. Nature can be unpredictable. So ideally, we want to find some sort of energy storage technology that can complement renewables to transition to a more sustainable energy infrastructure. And some of these solutions can help us do that. There's not going to be one solution that wins out. It'll be a mix. It's sort of a all hands on deck situation. So I think exploring multiple options, investing in multiple options is the best way forward. When the fossil fuel infrastructure was built, it was done under many decades. Now we need to figure out what are the best choices, most functional choices are, and then build a whole lot of it really fast. Another area is finance, and I was looking at and considering just investment into this sector, and I wanted to share this with you. Global investment in renewable energy was up this year. It rose 5% in the first half of 2020, defying COVID-19 recessionary pressures. Overall, clean energy investment, including renewables capacity financing and corporate level equity deals, came into 137 billion in the first half of 2020, which was up 4% on last year. So it's been interesting to see that renewable energy capacity investment during the first half of 2020, in the face of the shock caused by COVID, has been in place. Offshore wind had its far busiest half year ever for financial investment decisions, and I would like to see that trend moving onshore. I mean, overall, renewables have been helped by improved competitiveness and by investor appetite for assets offering secure cash flows. However, we're now hearing that project developers face the challenge that key people, whether at the permitting, financing, or construction stages, can't meet face to face. So that's an interesting area. Maybe we can discuss that during the Q&A. This is all dwarfed by UK public spending on COVID. Set to rocket past $1 trillion. I can't help but think, and of course this is money hopefully well spent, as I don't underestimate COVID. My family's been affected by it, but I can't help but think what would happen if an equal amount was to go into the climate crisis. So another aspect of how will we get there, we've mentioned policy a few times. I have been hearing policy pressure and policy variability, and in some cases policy uncertainty, since the first day I got involved in clean tech back in 2008. These guys, I mean, are they? Some of them won't still be alive at 2050. So I have to challenge, commitments. Some of these, some statements are easy to make when you're not going to be around to be held accountable for them. So some things that I will just put in for consideration. How could we get there? Set a carbon price, make it stick. Prioritize skills training in renewables. During the Great Depression, Roosevelt came up with a jobs package that helped put people to work. 1 out of every 8 of us here in the UK is going to be looking for work next year. So how do we mobilize them? How do we retrain? How do we provide a future for unemployed? I'm a big believer in incentives, not for the sake of incentives, but to encourage risk capital to come into the market. The EIS scheme is good at that. Shall we tax climate damaging behaviors? And above all, could we at least stop backdoor subsidies for fossil fuel interests. Over the last 7 years, we've been backdooring overseas support for energy investment in developing countries on fossil fuels. I think that's wrong. I think that needs to stop. So I have to leave this, and I know Judith likes an upbeat close. Will we get there? Can we get there? I think we can. But here's the challenge. We can have loads of meetings, but unless the will for significant change is there, net zero could be a challenge to achieve in most of our lifetimes, if not at all. I never thought that I would be paraphrasing a 17-year-old girl, but I have to admire the mobilization that Greta Thunberg has been able to gain, and the awareness that she has held, making the climate crisis front and center. We really have to start thinking about this actively as a real crisis it is. So I encourage you all to think positive, think smart, think 2030 targets. Thank you, George. And think like our lives depend on it, because I think it kind of does. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're an investor looking for some deals such as the ones that we showed you previously, then the Zoom door is always open for you, and I'm looking forward to a lively Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Very positive ending there, and I think that breaking down the timelines and looking at 2030 and what we need to do to get there is how we will try and focus certainly the panel discussion, and some of the questions that are coming through certainly seem to be in that order as well. So thank you. Next up, our final presentation before the discussion, Stuart Lunn, Commercial Director of RES. Over to you, Stuart.
Thanks, Angus, and some really interesting presentations there. Just whilst I'm bringing mine up, what I'd like to do in this session is just talk a bit about some of the both the opportunities and the challenges from a perspective of a renewables developer and operator of wind, solar, and storage. A couple of the interesting themes there, I think, in terms of challenges we're going to face are planning in particular, and also just the fundamental changes that are going to happen to the market going forwards. So hopefully my screen should be appearing soon. So George touched earlier on some of the targets we're seeing coming through, and I think it's just worth reflecting that these are really positive steps that we're seeing from government and also from Committee on Climate Change. We're seeing a target of 35 gigawatts being suggested by CCC by 2035. Government's talking about 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And this is really positive. It's going to drive interest and investment into the UK sector. But it does beg the question, as everyone else has been asking, of how do we get there? So George has discussed planning challenges, so I'll leave those to one side. But the other area I'd like to explore is, what are the challenges posed by the fundamental shift in our market, our wholesale electricity market, which will be posed by this? So historically, our electricity system has been designed around efficient dispatch of thermal plants. But if we're to achieve net zero, then by 2030, we're going to have 70% of our generation output, which will be zero marginal cost, and 80% by 2050. So if you're a wind farm or a solar farm, for every extra gigawatt that you deliver onto the system, you end up depressing the capture price which you can earn. And we actually saw this really starkly quite recently when government came out and announced a 40 gigawatt ambition for offshore wind. When power price consultants updated their forecast, we saw a drop of around £3 to £5 a megawatt hour in forward-looking capture prices for wind, and that's really substantial. So there are some fundamental challenges we need to address in looking about how we're going to deal with a market which shifts to zero marginal cost. So there's two areas I wanted to discuss. One was, what do our policies need to look like in addressing this? But it's not just about looking to government. I think we need to look to ourselves as an industry and say, well, how do we need to evolve and adapt, both in the way we're designing, but also the way we're developing and operating onshore wind and solar. So onto policies. These have been touched on briefly before. CFDs, I thought it was really great to see onshore wind and solar back into the CFD pot. Whenever I speak to investors, what I really hear is that's great news. We need more clarity going forwards beyond auction round 4 to say, well, how much of the volume is going to be? What's the budget setting process? Will onshore wind actually be eligible beyond next year's auction? We don't know the answers to that. And what the investors are really seeking is some long-term clarity on the investability of the market. And the more clarity we have, the more competitive cost of capital we attract to the UK. And that's going to feed straight through into consumer prices. So it's really important to get that long-term clarity, and hopefully that will start to come through fairly soon. Secondly, carbon price. When the wholesale market comes under pressure, we are going to need to have a clear long-term price trajectory. Next, I wanted to briefly touch on demand and flexibility. This is a whole webinar in itself, and it's been mentioned a few times, I think, in the recent presentation from Robert. But if we're going to have a system which has this level of wind and solar, we're going to need way more flexible low carbon generation. We're going to need more intelligent demand side response. And we've seen some good steps from government in terms of publishing a recent report on business cases for hydrogen, in terms of market signals for electric vehicle charging. But we need a lot more, and I'm hoping the new energy white paper that's going to come out soon is going to give us a clear pathway for real strong investment signals for these technologies to come through and support. And finally, on the policy side, it would be great, I think, if there was an equivalent target for onshore wind and solar that we have for offshore wind. But it's very easy, I think, as an industry to look to government and say, come on, we need policies to evolve. I think we also need to look to ourselves and say, well, how are we going to adapt to these new market dynamics? What can we do differently? And that's an area which RES has been looking at an awful lot over the last few years. And I think it's really interesting. The world in which we used to operate solar farms and wind farms is changing. You would typically have built a solar or wind farm and let it run, and the output would be dictated by the prevailing weather conditions. We now need to be a lot more flexible and intelligent in terms of how we're operating wind and solar plants. We need to try and make them flexible, and where we can, we need to try and make them dispatchable. One of the most interesting growth areas here, I think, is solar and storage hybrids. And RES has been involved in this for a while, particularly in the US. We did a project here which was for a utility in Texas, where they wanted to explore how they could dispatch PV onto the system. And actually, what you're seeing in California now is that it's quite common for utilities, instead of procuring their peak load requirement from gas peakers, they'll go out and procure it from solar plus storage projects. And it's not just because there's mandates on it, it's because the economics are starting to look more favorable for solar and storage. And I think there's a real opportunity there for the UK market. With the right mechanics and incentives, we could start providing a fair chunk of our peak load requirement for solar and storage projects. The other shifting dynamic I wanted to briefly touch on is that for wind farms, Angus mentioned in his presentation that we're starting to see these participate much more in services like balancing mechanism, ODFM. I think 1.5 gigawatts went into ODFM recently. And so for anyone who's building a project today, a wind farm, well, it's great you're going to have a 15-year CFD, but these projects will last for 30 years. And so you're having to take a view on day one of what your merchant operating strategy will look like for at least 15 years at the back end of your project. And you need to think quite hard around what additional services you'll be providing, and what effectively is going to be your revenue stack for these wind farms. Because you will need to think about how you can provide additional services to the system operator, be it balancing mechanism, ODFM, power available. And I think that's going to be a really integral part of the operating strategy and business case for wind going forwards. So perhaps just to sum up, I think we do have some challenges to face, but I think the right kind of tools and the right kind of thinking and operating strategies are already emerging there. We need the right kind of policies as well. But I think generally it's where there's challenge, there's also huge opportunity. And I think it's a really exciting time for wind and solar in particular at the moment. So on that note, I'll hand back to Angus. Thanks.
RES are undertaking. that concludes the presentations, and what I'd like to now do is turn to our panel discussion, which will follow by some Q&A. There's been some really interesting questions coming through. So just while everyone's cameras and microphones are being enabled, I think we'll start. I've got a few points to bring in here, pulled from the presentations, and we'll see how we go. I think I'll start with you, George. The spot the problem was your last slide. The theme of your presentation very much around landscape and visual challenges and perceptions that have been built up in the industry over a number of years. What I'd like to call out to this is one, can you allude to your point on that last slide, but also give us the one key takeaway that you'd like to give us all today in terms of what we need to do to improve that situation.
Yeah, thanks very much, Angus. Well, the poll results show, I think as expected, really, the winner was landscape policy and planning at 38%, access to SCFD 28%, public opinion 32%. So it's a relatively even spread, but clearly landscape policy and planning is the winner. I wonder whether I could just share my screen. I don't know if that's possible with my Spot the Problem competition.
I think it's worth trying out.
I think I am sharing it, but yeah. There you go. So my Spot the Problem was, what are the purple dots? Now remember, this is an area that the local authority recommends is one that's a preferred area for wind farms. Each one of these dots is a wind farm proposal that has been in the system over the last 10 years in this area, and all of them were refused. So,
George, why were they refused?
Go figure. For a whole range of reasons, but landscape impact predominantly.
And what is it we need to do, George, to try and win hearts and minds here? Is it the authority and the policy that we need to look at? Is it winning hearts and minds in consumers and the rural community? What can you draw and show us what sort of opinions there are out there at the moment?
Well, I think hearts and minds is an interesting one, because poll after poll shows about 80% of people like onshore wind farms. Virtually every poll that you see, the number of people that actually just don't like the look of wind farms is around 11%. So we're in an emergency situation, yet policy appears to be taking the 11% view more seriously than the 80% view. Now, it's always important to have a reasonable debate about whether a wind farm is in an area is appropriate or not. But what happens usually is a bit of a sleight of hand. A landscape professional, generally very small number of them, generally not really associated with wind farm development, do studies. It's their opinion that says a wind farm of this scale in this area is not appropriate. And then that is translated by a local authority into a local development plan. And suddenly that view of the world becomes conflated with, this is what the public in this area think. And so these studies, based on the opinion of a landscape architect, tend to inject conflict into the planning process. Now, what we need to do is take heat out of the process, not inject it in. And so some of the landscape interest language is about preloading the system to guide development to the right places. Actually, what they're really doing is preloading it with conflict. unnecessarily so on subjective matters, and really we should have a site-by-site approach and not a central kind of opinion-based approach in the view of a very small number of landscape architects and landscape interests.
Good. Okay, thank you, George. I think the point is well heard there. So moving on to some of the opportunity. Penny, Robert, you both talked about innovative technologies and the role that they have to play. What I'd like to just talk about here is, with the increasing penetration of renewables on the system and the role that independent generators can play in that, where does innovation and flexibility cross over here? Flexible technologies required to balance the system. Have we got established technologies? Have we got the right solutions? Or are there some exciting solutions coming through the development pipeline at the moment? And how do you see that? And Robert, you talked about it, your slide showed quite a number. There must have been a dozen different opportunities there. What do you see fitting the mix? And let's focus on the next 10 to 20 years.
So you're looking for some market pointers there, are you, Angus? Oh, we are awash with innovation. I don't think that every innovation is practical, is realizable. It's part of our job, and I think the role of VCs is to pick the ones that have the most viability in the marketplace, make sure that they're supported, and generate returns for their investors. Some of the things that I think are interesting and exciting, as I alluded to, but before our cryogenic and thermal and compressed air storage. I'm a big fan of storage. Whether it's traditional pumped hydro or even gravity. There's a Scottish company in Edinburgh called Gravitricity. I'll give a shout out to them. They're not a client, but that's a really intriguing concept that they've just done a crowd round for to raise capital for a proof of concept to use a gravity approach. So basically a large counterweight to generate electricity. I think the grid balancing, because the whole grid was based on a centralized broadcast out type of approach, and now we're moving to decentralized approaches is important. I think I saw, and I might be preempting a bit of the Q&A, but I saw that heat wasn't mentioned in the presentation. That was actually one of the technologies on my slide. Energy efficiency and heat efficiency and dealing with waste heat is an area that we're seeing getting traction in the marketplace. There's a whole range of stuff. I would argue that if it's a commercially viable program, it should get support and should be at least trialed in a real life situation, so that we can determine whether it requires greater investment support.
Great, and Penny, just if you'd like to come in here and just talk, add to that as well.
What I find really interesting is the idea of decentralization. We tend to think that most of the country's on the national grid. That's not technically entirely true. Most people are on the national grid, but in Scotland, over 80% of the people live in a tiny strip of land in the middle. Most of the country of Scotland is not on the national grid. People are having to burn fuel oil. My sister has a fuel oil burner. She gets electricity, but she doesn't get gas, and she probably never will. And the other thing is, quite often where most of the renewable energy is, the great hydropower sites, some of the great wind sites, are not where people live. And so if we could come up with, well, there are ways of doing it. What needs to be come up is a financially viable way of doing it. there's no reason why you couldn't have green hydrogen and green ammonia produced in the Highlands of Scotland, where there's plenty of energy. Transporting it is, you do it the same way as we do oil. I mean, there's no reason why an oil rig that when it's decommissioned, instead of getting rid of it, you turn it into an offshore wind solar farm that produces ammonia, and then you use the same infrastructure to pipe it to land. And then you burn that instead of oil and use the existing infrastructure. But that requires some serious blue sky thinking, investment, and somebody other than me.
Well, perhaps a bigger team in the innovation industry. Exactly. Good. Thank you, Penny.
Angus, just to add a thought there on some of the comments that were coming up. I think one of the challenges we have on delivering flexibility and storage longer term is that the market signals just aren't really there at the moment, and the policies aren't quite there. What we saw with short duration storage, sort of the 1 hour, 2 hour, that the markets for EFR and FFR in UK and for DS3 in Ireland have been hugely successful. So if you have a battery storage project, then great. But we really need to see something similar for longer duration applications, particularly as you get more wind and solar. So something that supports intraday storage, seasonal storage. The incentives aren't quite there for these technologies to reach commercial scalable deployment. But I think that would be a really interesting ask to see something more in the energy white paper that points a direction towards this.
That's very interesting. We are seeing some trials that National Grid are doing at the moment with storage to change the revenue certainty from more of a utilization to an availability type payment. There's some trials going on at the moment, and actually they're looking for more participants to do that later in the year. Stuart, what are some of the things we can learn from the projects in the US that we could bring across here as an industry? I like the focus on us trying to solve some of the problems ourselves as well as looking to the policymakers.
I think one of the interesting developments in the US markets, and obviously they're different markets depending on which transmission zone you're in there. But the interesting developments we see is in solar plus storage, which I touched on earlier, and over there, because it's utilities that are procuring the power, they're able to take a slightly different view in terms of procuring their peak load requirement. So you'll quite often see solar plus 4, 5, 6 hours of storage being able to completely displace gas peakers. I think if we had the right mechanics here to reward that kind of 4 or 5 hour period in the UK, you'd see some really interesting developments. I think that's probably the most exciting growth area that I see that we can learn on from US storage.
Thanks, Stuart. Penny, you had your hand up.
Yes, I was just going to jump on that. It's very frustrating that when it comes to nuclear, the government freely admits it needs subsidy, but we need a certain amount of baseload at the moment to stabilize our grid. Yeah, when it comes to renewables, no difference is made between baseload or dispatchable energy. And if they gave us a fraction of the subsidy giving to nuclear, you'd for 5, 6 hour storage for hydropower, there'd be a revolution. But no difference is seen. Everything's equal, and it just isn't. In order for a functioning grid, we need dispatchable energy, we need baseload, and so we can balance out more and more of the cheap wind and the cheap solar.
Good. Now, I think what we'll do is turn to the financing side of it, if you like, just to wrap up the panel discussion. I ran a poll at the start, and thank you for those that contributed, around what the biggest challenges are for independent generation. And similar to the results that we received online last week, policy and revenue certainty are key to this. In terms of finance options, I'm going to come back to you, George. What are you seeing in terms of investor appetite in the renewables market, flexibility as well, if that's what you're exploring, and is in fact revenue certainty one of the key areas that is challenging that perspective?
Yeah, I think we're still seeing a significant appetite for investment, but the basic issue, which I think I've alluded to earlier, is that projects need to be really efficient, and that's where the scale of turbines comes in, which takes me back to my whole argument about landscape policy. But we're still seeing significant appetite, but it's getting the individual projects to be able to maximize yield in areas to make the business case work is the challenge. So clearly, there's a number of significant projects going through the system just now, which are being built out on a merchant basis, and people are waiting on a CFD to provide some kind of certainty over the long term, so that the debt financing can be secured at a low enough interest rate to make projects work. So there's and people are chasing after a fairly limited PPA market, but all of these things are fairly they're either niche or they're driving prices down significantly. And so the whole thing comes back to a question of how can your site be able to maximize yield. And I would come back to the point made around the downward pressure on prices as more renewable energy comes onto the system. That's because we're currently operating in a power price market on its own. When the market is enabled through the delivery of electricity via hydrogen or direct or through storage to supply heat and transport, then the demand for renewable electricity rises exponentially, and it's getting those policy levers into alignment. So we have sufficient investment in decarbonisation of transport and sufficient investment and policy support for heat pumps, where we will see a real breakthrough, and that would enable the power price projections to be a lot more positive than they currently are.
Thanks. Good. Okay. Thank you very much. I think what we will do now is move to the Q&A section in the last 15 minutes that we've got. Some great questions coming through, so we'll try and answer these in the order they appear. Starting with hydrogen. An interesting question about where does hydrogen fit in with all of this, and Robert, I wonder whether you could enlighten us on any experience you have here, or what you're seeing and how this is evolving.
Not yet. I mean, there are regulatory moves to make hydrogen the replacement fuel for gas, for natural gas going forward. On the innovation side, I haven't seen much technology coming out to support that. I mean, green hydrogen was mentioned, and there is a massive gearing up for investment by the majors, whether it's green or actually brown hydrogen is remaining to be seen. I'm seeing the rise of conferences about green hydrogen, but the investor demand. I'm not having investment funds beating on the door saying where are the green hydrogen opportunities as of yet. I don't know if any of the other panelists have a view.
I'm aware of projects for the Scottish Government are looking to see if they can produce green hydrogen in the Highlands and Islands for buses. And the reason why this may be feasible where it isn't elsewhere is fuel prices in remote areas is a lot higher. And so you're not having to compete with cheap electricity or cheap oil prices. You're having to compete with the inflated oil prices that people in the rural areas have to. So that's something that I believe is being launched for competitive bids for people to say we might be able to help here. And it is about hydrogen-based buses.
That's a really interesting area. Hydrogen transport is something that we are, seeing. There's a Brighton-based play called River Simple that is developing hydrogen-based cars. Hugo Spar's been working at that for about 15 years, and it looks like they've got a very sexy model that is ready for release pretty soon.
Thank you. George, you had your hand up. Would you like to contribute there?
Yeah, I think an interesting question is the role for green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen, and my own possibly simplistic view of it is, if government policy and funding and support goes into green hydrogen, that creates demand for renewable electricity. If it goes into blue hydrogen, it reduces demand for renewable electricity. Kind of know which side of the debate I'm on, but I worry that really blue hydrogen is pie in the sky. The costs associated and the logistics associated with carbon capture and storage are unproven, are uncertain, whereas we know we can deliver it with green hydrogen. So I'd quite like to see governments come off the fence on that front and support the renewable sector.
Okay, on to the next question. This is, what can the industry do to improve co-locating generation close to demand to capture additional benefits? Is this a data problem, an engagement problem, or a policy problem? Stuart, have you got anything that you can allude to here from your experience at RES?
So if I've understood the question correctly, it's can we locate solar or wind potentially closer to the demand on the distribution network?
Exactly. What can we do to bring demand and generation closer together? So I think we're talking about on-site, but as well as actually projects located at the right points on the network.
Okay, well, maybe 2 quick points. I think both related to grids, as people would expect. I think one, the distribution network needs quite a lot of work if you're going to make that happen. And obviously the ED2 is coming up soon, so maybe that's something that actually DNOs need to start thinking about in business cases. But the other one is, as an investor in one of those projects, you're going to need to have real clarity on what your demand tariffs are going to look like, because the real economics of those kind of projects, if you're going behind the meter, is reduction in your peak demand usage and your ongoing tariffs. So at the moment, there isn't a great deal of long-term certainty on those kind of prices. So how do you build a long-term business case? There needs to be some kind of forward-looking guidance, I think, in terms of distribution charges that would help people take the plunge in that more than they do.
And is there anything any insight we've got in terms of private virtual PPAs matching the generation with consumers who can actually guarantee that through some sort of corporate PPA arrangement?
You do see a lot of companies exploring private wire PPAs versus virtual or synthetic or sleeve PPAs. You really have to have the right site, and you have to be able to have the footprint on your site. There's not that many companies who have got the space for a solar farm of, say, 2 megawatts co-located to their demand. So people do explore it, but in our experience, the vast majority end up going down the virtual or the sleeve PPA route to get their power.
Great, thank you. Next question here. What's the role for small community projects, particularly solar and hydro have been noted here, and individual solar on house roofs? There are big city areas available for this. I wonder, particularly with the hydro spin on it, whether Penny, you've got some insight here.
Yes, it was actually the Water of Leith, the river going through Edinburgh, that inspired this whole thing, because there are some pretty spectacular and beautiful weirs, and there was a study done that showed that none of them were viable for community energy, which seemed a real waste. And the main reason was because you could only use 20% of the water, And it seemed to me the obvious thing to do was use more water, but for less environmental damage. And so that's why I fell down this particular rabbit hole, was community energy. And prior to 2017, there were at least 3 sites in Edinburgh that would have been viable using the community energy model, in part because with communities, the rate of return is generally acceptable at a lower level. People are happy with 3 to 5%. Unfortunately, as I said, this whole tax thing has just killed it. But for a while there, the Community Energy Scotland did instill and generate a lot of community projects, and the want is there, the investment is there, the communities are there. What isn't there is politicians in part willing to stand up to the NIMBYs. There was a project in Balerno, totally inoffensive, held up for years because of a couple of people who thought that it was profiteering, which it wasn't. It took Fergus Ewing, the Minister of Energy at the time, to step in and force it through. And did it make the news? No, because it's completely inoffensive. So the problem is political capital is needed to build these. Political capital is needed to make the rates sensible. And until someone is willing to stand up and expend that political capital, we're kind of stuck. So that's a shout out to Rishi Sunak and Paul Wheelhouse.
Well done, Penny. Thank you. Good. Okay, and we've got time for just one more question so that we wrap this up on time. Do you think the UK government should bring back the fit for solar PV and onshore wind? If yes, how could we work together to help benefit low-income households, local communities, and maximise community benefit? So we're talking there about reintroduction of subsidy schemes, but also how do we control the cost of it with the CFDs and hopeful reform of those for next year to include onshore wind and solar. I guess the question to the panel is, how do you see that fitting the bill, or does more need to be done?
Personally, I would like to see feed-in tariffs for community schemes. There's no point giving more feed-in tariffs to hydro, because at the moment, if you gave more, you just end up paying more tax. So until that's sorted, there's not much point. But get the subsidy system in place for community energy, and then you can have as many conditions regarding community benefits, because already you pay less tax if 10% of your profit goes to good local causes. And some of the stuff that's been done is just great, getting equipment for local schools, helping out the disabled, all sorts. So it's already been done. Community Energy Scotland is on the ball, but it's not happening at the moment, which is a real shame.
Thank you. And around the panel, just to finish this off then, are the current incentive schemes doing enough? Stuart, should we start with you?
Yeah, I think it's great to see CFDs back for onshore wind and solar. They get us some of the way there. We have to recognise that we still need more thought to how we're dealing with the fact that we have an energy system which is moving zero marginal cost, and we need to have a bit more evolution of policy that helps address that sort of 2030s, 2040s, 2050s world when we are at 80% renewables. That's a really interesting area.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, there was another question. We've run out of time for to take any more here. We will answer those directly that have been asked. There was a particular one to George about landscape and where responsibility sits for policy on that. We'll get back to you directly on that, or please reach out to any of us individually if you'd like to take the discussion further. All that remains is for me to thank, first of all, the panel for your presentations and very open discussion there. I think it's been a very interesting process for me. I've certainly learnt a lot, and I think there are lots of actions that can be taken from various points of the industry in our roles and day-to-day life. Thank you to All Energy, Judith and your team for organising and facilitating this and opening up to the wide audience. And lastly, to the audience for your time, contribution in the polls, great questions, some of which we managed to get through, others we will answer later. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a good afternoon.
Okay.